It came out of a very specific event above an Imma, where the manager of the building that I worked at, we were at a seminar on drawing. And he just made a comment. He said, "What's so special about this?" He said, "We got work just as good as this below." And I said, "Yeah, we do." And he said, "Well, can we do something about it?" And I said, "We'd be open to it." So he went away and started checking things out. But indeed, we got onto the Serious Art Centre and they gave us a couple of names. And for some reason, we picked on Miss Marie Brett. We rang her up, she came down, we had a meeting, she became interested. And we said that what we simply wanted to do with the group of people in St. Raphael's who made art, who saw themselves as artists, they just were interested in having an exhibition. But they wanted to have it just so people could come in and see their work and not be concerned about who or where they came from or that they carried any tag of disability or anything. So Marie was quite interested in that, and she obtained what she called, which was very clever, a year sitting in. She got to know the institution and the place. We began, and it was very successful. Marie would work with the artists, and we had a studio out of the institution so that people were able to work completely free of any interference. Marie would come back at the end of it and we'd have a talk. And one day she said something to me regarding one particular individual. And she said, "Would it be okay for me to, basically critique this?" And I said, "Well, it's your job. You're the artist." And that was the beginning, I think, of the kernel of On the Edge of My Sky, it has led us to where we are today.
And I think the fact that you guys were really forefronting the art, this sense of producing material with a public outcome was in the mix. And for me, the really big thing that caught me was the guys were going to get a studio that we could leave stuff and kind of ease into creatively, which is a really massive resource in the sense of being able to make work and then leave it out and then come back to it. So we could be ambitious, think beyond the packing up every week. And the fact that it was outside the institution, as John calls it, gave great liberty, I thought. So it felt like it could be ambitious, but it felt like the guys had a really good sense of what they were about. And we had a good block of time. So I was thinking, I was interested because a long way from where I live, it was kind of a big undertaking. I thought, yeah, this is getting into something different. And I think John was present, but not in the room, but really present in the space. So present in the institution and present with the attendee who came and was present with me in terms of what I was doing that then could be quite different to what John's an art therapist in the space could be doing. And that's when we'd kind of drive back, wouldn't we, after each week's session and get into this thing of me touching base through John's eyes, almost of like, well, I feel I really want to push this and I want to critique this and want to explore this, and this has to move on to another area if we're looking at the artwork, but how does that stand? And then there'd be sort of lots of health and safety things and things where I could feel in other settings potentially a bit vulnerable in terms of the expectation of my role and what I was holding in the space, practically and emotionally, but with John in the background, that was all held in a much broader way for me. We looked a lot reflectively about the role that I adopted as an artist in the space and the kind of intention I, as the artist, brought to the space. Now I'm in a different position at that stage. It was very much looking at facilitating a productive, dynamic space for others to create art. And I ethically was challenged myself about whether I was making art in that space or whether I was serving the need of others, and adopted the latter. That I didn't feel it was ethically appropriate for me to make art in that space. I now co-create with people, so that's a whole different thing. But I suppose whose motivation brought certain priorities within a broader ethical frame of, back to what John said at the very beginning, when I felt I might crush someone through asking provocative questions or being very challenging for the betterment of the artwork in terms of, have you thought about this, have you thought about that? Not, critiquing in the broader sense in terms of developing ideas, but ethically that was the ground that the artist was brought in to make the art the best and bravest and most exciting it could be, with John's backup. So I think if John wasn't there, I'd have probably been a bit more cautious ethically in terms of how much I'd push ideas and be provocative and bring in new things and new thinking. But I felt safe in going further out on that, if that makes sense.
Could be, it wouldn't have been in isolation, the project. It would have been embraced and welcomed.
I think this falls under ethical, but it goes back to the challenge. And I think one of the things in terms of that project that you both did was that you were taking kind of the artwork from a kind of supported studio out into a public space, as in the Sirius Gallery, and that was, in a sense, the work that you did there was the impetus really for the exhibitions that we had when I was at Crawford in relation to Outside In and Perceptions in 2013, which was about individuals and supported studios. And I know you had this issue in the public's reaction to actually seeing the artwork and then finding out that they were individuals who had a learning disability. And actually, I know you had the comment from somebody that they would have liked to have known that beforehand because they wouldn't have critiqued it in the same way. For me, it throws up this whole thing about, what is creativity, what is art making, what the hell are kind of art colleges for in the first place? In terms of if we're kind of taking this artwork from these individuals who are passionate about it and putting it into the public domain, how is that seen against, formal or traditional kind of views of what the artist is and how they come about to be accomplished, and what do we mean by that? So, and I think there's kind of an ethical thing within that because there's potentially discrimination. I know certainly from I'd say the arts establishment, which isn't necessarily very clear, and it's often said behind closed doors, or certainly not to your face, but I have that experience, and I think John and Mary did.
Also, at the time of that, go back to the original On the Edge of My Sky, when we held the exhibition in the Sirius, I was challenged outside on the opening night outside the door by a young artist. Anyway, he was quite upset because of comments he'd made and the way he had critiqued the work. He said that he would not have said what he said if he'd known that, which probably goes back to what Ed is saying, there is a kind of a benign bias or, oh, God help us, you kind of think about it. And it interests me, the whole notion of outsider art. Why does that expression even exist? If there's outsider, there must be insider. But what does it mean anything at all? I mean, that first that exhibition that Ed related to, spoke of, the one which was all over the city, was a great experience to walk in and see that work. I saw people engaging with some of the artists and just being so empowered or excited by the responses and the originality of the emotional originality of the response they got from many of the artists.
I think it's an interesting thing related to, it can be all the things John's saying there in terms of very positive, but it can also be a really scary landscape to put your work out publicly. And if you're taking the ground as an artist without any, John and myself used to use the word tag, so without the contextualization of any particular kind of reference point for people to enter the work, so the public are looking at the work in and of its own merit and then making judgment based on it. That can be a really scary, really tough landscape for any artist. So it's then who owns the responsibility of making that implicit in the space that this could happen, and or who supports that to happen, potentially as taking the brave ground of being an artist, and then what happens afterwards. And I think something John said there a bit is interesting. You said it previously, of sometimes this was the project we did was very long, and there was the expectation that things could carry on afterwards. So it was kind of not a project in the same way of, if work's exhibited from a project and contextualized, and then it's an entity in itself, and then when the work's taken down, nobody continues making work. And so the work's kind of, crystallized into a moment in time that people participated in, and it's, seen through a very particular lens. That kind of work's very different to what John and myself were doing. But I think institutionally, there can be lots of reasons why institutions do contextualize the exhibitions they've got, to do with lots of things in terms of parity and, all sorts of stuff as to why they do or don't. But that isn't necessarily to do with the artwork.
I think what was unique about that on the Edge of Sky was that whether John and Maria wanted it, it kind of put you in the position, not opposing positions, but in the position of actually, what do I do? What do you do? What's the similarity? What's the difference? What's going on here? And I think, for me, that seemed to be the first time, certainly here in Ireland, that notion in terms of different positions and different roles between the artist and the art therapist became illuminated. And I think that was kind of major development from it, I think, alongside the idea of kind of the supported studio and actually, artists in that sphere being recognised.
There's probably something interesting to say about that, because I think you're right, Ed. And I think from my point of view, because the project that John and Ned got funded was through the local authority, their arts office, primarily. And I think when I look back now, I see my role as a facilitator. Maybe you'd see it as an artist in residence facilitator. But then because John and myself were in this constant dialogue and doing what Ed was just saying there in terms of similarities, differences, crossover, the local authority said, well, could you do something with this? They didn't say it like that, but that's kind of what they were meaning. Can you explore this? And I was kind of excited by that, because that gave me something that was a stake in the project that was public, whereas my stake in the project was very hidden as a facilitator fundamentally. So then when John and myself started writing stuff, it enabled us to go to Ed and kind of think about it critically. And it was in a public space then, separate to the studio space.
I've come up with a feeling that when we did initially, Marie and myself work together, it was a very specific thing. And I know, as I said, the differences and the similarities, that became something we worked on and looked at. But since then, I think, and if at the time I would have, probably the advice I would have given to actors or art therapists would be to be very cognizant of their specific and different roles. But today I would advise a more together approach. I think there is an opportunity there to be more engaging with each other. I wouldn't see it as clear cut as I did then. I don't know, would you agree with that, Marie?
I think I would agree. And I think I could talk from the artist's perspective of needing support to be kind of critically engaged with and about the work. So as well as being in the work, doing it, to actually have space. Like I think I'd advise artists, to seek some kind of support to facilitate a space that enables you to critically engage in the thinking. So, whether you shadow someone or whether it's a mentor or an advisor or however that works, but to go into the unknown fringe, what John and myself used to call the grey space of the work, I think means that you can progress beyond what you know. And I think I kind of agree with what John said in terms of similarities and differences, but I think we didn't crystalline down what I now see as there's almost three aspects to the work. There's the kind of artist working in a co-creating, making artwork together way. There's the arts facilitatory way, and there's the art therapist way. We only looked at the kind of the artist was a broad mush of everything. Whereas I think, well, it's actually far more complex than that in terms of what the field is doing.
And I think the common term that's kind of which in my head was seeking, whether it's seeking support, but seeking a connection and not fear that. And it's kind of interesting what each is expecting of the other, and what, not necessarily, anxiety is probably the wrong word, but the kind of almost the awkwardness in terms of the other. I think one of the complications, and it's probably, and this kind of comes into providers in terms of who provide funding, whether it's for artists or art therapists, is the way that kind of the arts therapists have broadened their spectrum of environments that they work in. In the sense of community art therapy. When I trained, it was very much kind of the clinical component of actually sitting in a room somewhere with confidential written on the door. What did you know? That literal sense of therapy, and how kind of certainly, and it's changed over the years, but certainly in the last 10 years. Whereas, the idea of kind of working with somebody in an open space is common. now, or it's kind of it's a possibility, and it's coming into the trainings, and I've got nothing. I think that's wonderful. The complexity that then gives the viewer in terms of what's art therapy, what's arts in health, where does this take place? It's less of an issue in a sense for kind of the artist and art therapist, although kind of that's complex anyway. But I think it's more of an issue for providers in terms of, what I've got X amount of money, what do I buy? One of the ideas that we'd had was that about actually getting kind of artists and arts therapists to work together or to have a conversation. And I think we thought it'd be brilliant to have an exhibition in relation to that. But that's very complex in a way, in the sense of having a venue and all of that. And I thought, God, that's really something interesting and not simple, but more simplistic than a gallery, to actually kind of try and initiate that conversation and actually kind of have an online gallery in terms of what those conversations may or may not look like. So I think there's a real opportunity.
Something that's going to happen anyway, isn't it?
Hopefully.
In some form or another. You have kind of online counselling and all kinds of stuff developing now, there's no way you could stop it, or and the difficulty is that very often when you're in a role, you begin to resent any new changes rather than embracing them. And even though you may not see the possibilities of them, I think we need to be open, because change, as they say, change is the only constant. It's going to happen anyway.
I think there's I think for the artist, arts and health is phenomenally vast. And I think there's not much being talked about or written about in terms of the vastness of the area and the distinctnesses within it. And I think the area of, let's call it socially engaged work, or people working with other people who might not traditionally be artists, is blossoming throughout the country. But I think it would really benefit to have some thinking collectively done around people's intentions and priorities and where the artist sits in that. I think just harking back to the exhibition, I think that links in for me, that in terms of, it's obviously immensely practical and a lot easier to enable the exhibiting of artworks to be online. And I'd say, what does it do to the art? So for me, I'm coming from a very visceral, physical, emotional response to physical work, which you don't get when it's online, but there's obviously massive opportunities, and I've used them myself for other works in terms of access and enabling dialogue and enabling a trace for a work online for people that might not be able to go somewhere for 2 weeks or whatever, but it inherently changes the work. And I'd agree with John in the sense that can be positive and embraced, but it just needs to be talked about and owned, that it is then different. And if it's done for convenience, that's one thing. If it's done for some sense of access and trace down the line, or involving others, entry points into a discussion about it, that's very positive. But it loses something, so it needs to gain something in a trade, I would say.
In terms of kind of where the need is, in a sense, it feels perhaps coming more so from the artists than from the arts therapists in relation to that conversation, which we think is an important one to have. I don't know, would you both agree with that?
I think it's because the artists are seeing opportunities of applying for things and are constantly at the coalface of making proposals or fulfilling application forms, or and thus it's kind of they're always on new ground, treading new opportunities. So I see it as that they see that it's a new way of developing new work, and their ground isn't fixed because every project's different potentially.
It's a new start each time.
Whereas maybe the art therapist's world is inhabiting less unknown zones, in the sense of, let's collaborate, let's not collaborate, let's have 20 people to work with, let's have 5 people to work with, let's work in a hospital, let's work in a prison. The artist who's working on the ground is all over the place with all sorts of new possibilities.
I think the artist has to go searching for the opportunities, whereas very often the art therapist is approached.
And the artist is working with people, if they're socially engaged, or facilitating, they're working with people all the time. So it's kind of, to extend that into a professional relationship as well. It's maybe more in their DNA.
I do have a sense, without any kind of specific research as such, just to think that in terms of the art therapist generally, their relationship to their own creativity is probably less than the artist. Now, I know kind of, there are some art therapists who very much kind of would say, I'm an artist as well. But equally, I think there's predominantly probably more who, in reality, that label doesn't quite fit as much.
I've been thinking about that, the number of art therapists who were initially artists is quite high. And I've been kind of messing around with the idea that initially, when you're drawn to art therapy for some reason, very often it's just interest in their own work, in their own stuff, in their own situation, and then they get work as an art therapist, and they're what they call their private art practice begins to suffer. And I wonder, is there a kind of resentment that develops that may be affecting their work? Do they begin to resent the time that and the responsibilities that go with being an art therapist?
I think you're right. I think whether it's resentment, I don't know, but that kind of fits the bill for me in a way. The common thing that people would say is that I don't have the time, and that is a reality. I accept that. But there's also another reality that kind of there is something really very supportive and self-care-ish, what you gain from a sense of maintaining your own creativity. And I do. I think it's really easy to fall off the wagon, so to speak, in relation to that, because getting back onto it is infinitely difficult.
Some of the artists we spoke to, different people we spoke to talk about both those aspects, but it's very hard to inhabit the public sphere of work if you haven't got time to chase it. It's phenomenally difficult to do.
Many arts and health artists working in arts and health have said to me the feeling they have of not having enough time for their own work, and constantly working with other people, and developing projects and giving their all, and that they physically and mentally they just get tired and worn out. And many of them have said to me, I wish I could do my own work. I wish I had a studio. I wish I had a place to go and do it. I wish I had this. I wish I had that.
And I think that speaks right to the heart of that sense of that huge range of people working in the sphere of arts and health. And we were with a group of artists, weren't we? And one artist said, this is my work. I work with people and it is my practice, rather like myself, that the practice is all in one together. Whereas for a lot of people, they're distinctly separate. And there's a moment, I think, when other artists realise that and say, oh, but this is your work. So they don't see that you're holding them distinctly separate, which maybe like the arts therapist would be holding their practice, working with people, and then their practice that's their own art making separate. But I think a lot of arts and health practitioners are doing the same, which is what John's talking to there, enabling other people's creativity and having no room for your own beyond the hidden aspect of the facilitatory process. That's complicated, I think, for the field.
I think it's just an interesting kind of reflection for the art therapist to have in terms of, I'm going to say the expectation, or therapeutically we probably used other words, but the expectation that you have in terms of the client, the service user coming to a session and actually engaging with creativity. And yet it's kind of easy to separate that from how that engagement with creativity that's so important in the therapy room isn't as important for the art therapist in terms of their own sense of connection to their creativity and what it enhances for them. Because I think, I do think your relationship to your own creativity does affect your own way of using that medium within the therapy setting, in terms of what you see from your clients and your own engagement with them visually. I think this is evolving. I think one of the original aims in relation to all of this was disseminating the kind of the experience that we're having and our reflections, and actually getting engagement from that. And I think that wanting that engagement and dissemination is still very much there. In fact, that's probably more important now than it was maybe along the way, almost exploring the direct relationship between an artist and an arts therapist, and actually kind of what that might look like and how that might form in terms of an exhibition, whatever, that falls very much within that.
I'm really keen to nail in written form, in some form where we are now, the three of us. So to put this in written form, and we're trying to work out, whether that's 3 aspects or whether we interweave or whether we do both, but so that we commit to some new thinking on paper. I think that's really important, and because I then think that gives opportunity for others then to engage with that in the field. So I think if we commit to that and do that and put that out there, and put a bound on what that is in terms of the similarities, difference thing moved on, and some of the stuff we've been scoping out today, I think that then gives the field an opportunity to then engage with it. And I think the things that are standing out for me, and like Ed said, we're still really in the middle of it, but the things that seem to be standing out for me is from an artist's perspective, is this thing of the role of the artist. It seems to be needing further exploration across the country, I think, in terms of the expectations of where the artist stands. And I think it's very split, like we've talked about earlier, in terms of this facilitatory serving role and or co-creating the making of work. And I think that needs unpacking a lot more across the country. And I think supports is another big thing that I'm realising that I perhaps have to take a stab at advocating for, because I've worked in the field a long time, and I can look back over projects that I've been involved in and others have been involved in, and I can compare it directly, having learned a little bit from Ed and John in terms of supports that may be available to arts therapists that are certainly not available to artists, and so I'm talking about things like supervision or counselling or therapy, and or other ways of the artist supporting being brave and working with people. And I think also we're all living in we're living through a lot of emotional crisis, I think, in 2025 collectively. But I think artists going into the field, as it were, working directly with people in healthcare settings, need more support, definitely need more support, needs making it that it's, I would never say I'd advocate for it being mandatory, but it needs to be that the artist doesn't feel embarrassed or ashamed or feeling that they're failing to ask for that support. And it needs to be talked about in terms of funding opportunities if it's embedded in, and what kind of support is useful to artists, what form does it take. We were talking to the local authority, weren't we? And it was kind of, we were ending up on a road about training. And I'm not talking about training at all. I'm not talking about kind of feeling that you need to build better armour. I'm talking about having no armour and going in and doing really big, brave work. But the consequences of big, brave work with other people means that you might get a few scars along the way and need to address how you then support your scars, putting it really simplistically, as opposed to, being trained to cope. I think that's falling into the stereotype of, yet again, artists feeling that they should be able to be well equipped, well trained, go in and be wonders, masters of the universe and do everything and anything. Whereas I think the practice needs to say, well, that's wonderful and that's a great opportunity to do that. But inherently, as artists, we need some support, and other professions see this as a standard thing, So I think that, and then I think the opportunity to collaborate with art therapists is really exciting. I think John and myself did it inadvertently, and I could see what it gave to the work, what it gave to me as a practitioner, what it gave to me as an artist. I think there's one person that we spoke to who has done that since, has worked in the field with an artist and an art therapist collaborating, and it sounded great. So I think there's loads of potential there. It's down to funding and down to both the health world and the art world seeing potential in it. I don't think it's one or the other, but I think it's both. So it's kind of then back to nailing, things like the priorities and motivation and the output from each field. What does it offer? So what does it offer an arts therapist to work with an artist that's distinctly different? And how does it enrich their practice and vice versa? So I think those three things I'd hope that if we can get our written thing done, it might then offer space for us to talk more in a more focused way about some of the things we've said to kind of hone in to then talk a bit more deeper and affect the field. Artist practice, there needs to be change.
Yeah.
We've heard, I've certainly heard, I think John was alluding to it there, in terms of artists getting, exhausted at best, burnt out at worst from working in a field that doesn't offer supports.
And it's not, I don't think it's about kind of professionalizing kind of the artist in another level, which kind of makes them fit to working in arts and health. I think kind of that would be, it's not necessarily a danger, but I think that would be a very easy route to go down, that, to work in arts and health, you have to be this type of professional, as in, similar to the arts therapist. Because I think one of the things from the artists was very much that kind of they were envious of the arts therapists. They were seen, they thought they had recognition, they thought they had a status. I mean, the reality is something quite different. But nevertheless, that's seemed to be a kind of a general perception. But I think it would be would be something lost, I think, for the artist if they felt they had to have a specific qualification to then work within that, an arts and health setting, community, whatever. And now that's different from actually having skills, learning skills in relation to, what their needs are in terms of working in those environments, and that plays very much to what Mary was saying in terms about kind of knowing about the support that you actually need and actually knowing about the connections you need to make within that environment. When you're just going in for a couple of months or whatever it is, that's very much a different thing than kind of turning it into another profession.
But regularizing it in a profession, I mean, wouldn't really work because, as you said, they're going into different places all the time, different situations. So if you set out a set of rules and kind of stuff that people were given, they might apply to one or two places, but there, the diversity of the work opportunities. I think it's I use the word the kind of innocence of the artist going in and directly confronting those things gives value to the work. Whereas if you did professionalize and make them some sort of have a body of rules and theories behind them, they probably miss an awful lot. And it would be just come a dull kind of occupation.
I think what it kind of underlines is the importance of the education of the providers so that they understand, that if I have an artist in doing a project, this is what I need to be aware of in terms of supporting them and my responsibility in terms of supporting them in relation to the work they undertake. I know kind of when we talked to the arts officer from Cork there, but he kind of like took away the notion of duty of care and where does that reside?